The whisper behind the power, the scorching sun hovered over the narrow alleys of ancient Makkah as the dust swirled around a woman cloaked in black. Her eyes sharp like daggers cut through the crowd as she walked with deliberate grace. People moved aside not because of respect, but out of fear, for she was not just the wife of Abū Lahab, a wealthy man from the Quraysh tribe. She was Jamil, a name whispered behind closed doors with trembling voices. Merchants halted their bargaining, slaves paused mid-step, and even the elders avoided eye contact when she passed. Her mere presence in the bazaar could turn a peaceful morning into chaos. Her voice, though rarely raised, carried authority sharper than any sword, and when she did speak, no one dared challenge her word. But behind her imposing reputation lay a past wrapped in secrets, envy, and a burning hatred that changed the course of Islamic history. She was born into the powerful Banu Umayyad clan. Her real name was Arwa bint Harb, and she was the sister of Abu Sufyan, the future commander of Quraysh. Her family was proud, cunning, and feared. She was raised among men of politics and wealth, learning not only the art of speech but the deadly game of influence from an early age. Arwa showed signs of unusual intelligence and ambition. She could memorize bloodlines, understand trade routes, and manipulate conversations better than any boy in her clan. Her father once whispered to her mother, "This girl will shake Makkah one day," and those words stayed with her when she married Abū Lahab, a prominent Qurayshi noble. Her ambition found a perfect platform. Her husband was wealthy, respected, and already positioned to be a leader among his people. But it was Arwa who steered his decisions, whispered strategies in his ear, and corrected his judgments when he faltered. She was the shadow behind the throne, a force so subtle yet powerful that no one dared to confront her openly. Then came the man who would change everything. Muhammad, son of Abdullah, her nephew, and the man she loathed more than anyone else in the world. At first she ignored his quiet worship, his late-night prayers, and his kindness to slaves and orphans. But when he stood on Mount Safa and publicly declared his prophethood, calling people to abandon idols and worship one God, Arwa's world trembled. This was not just a spiritual threat. It was political, personal, and deeply humiliating. Her own tribe was being challenged. Her gods were being denied, and her family name was being mocked by someone she once considered beneath her. She was there when Abū Lahab shouted, "May you perish for this," and walked away from Muhammad on that day. She didn't stop him. She encouraged him. She inflamed his hatred, and soon it was not just her husband, but she herself who took charge in opposing the prophet's message. Unlike the Quraysh leaders who used counsel and boycott, Arwa used humiliation, gossip, and fear. Her weapon was not the sword, but the tongue, and it was sharper than steel. She spread lies about Muhammad, claiming he had gone mad, that he was trying to divide families, that he was only after power and fame. She hired poets to mock him during public gatherings. She paid children to follow him in the streets and shout names at him. But her most poisonous act was what she did in secret. At night she would collect thorny branches and spread them in front of the prophet's home path where he walked for Fajr prayer. She did it, not once, not twice, but again and again, like a ritual, a symbol of her rage, hoping he would bleed, hoping he would curse her, hoping he would stop. He never did. Each morning, he stepped over the thorns, without uttering her name, without returning hate for hate. That silence enraged her even more, and made her hatred grow like a disease inside her chest. One day, a slave girl saw her hiding near the prophet's house, and when the prophet emerged, she watched him calmly remove the thorns with his hands and walk away. Later that girl whispered to another, and soon it spread. The feared Jamil hides in darkness like a thief to hurt a man who does not even curse her back. This rumor shook Arwa to the core. Her image was everything. She was the queen of Makkah, the lady of command, not someone who crept like a coward in alleys. So she responded the only way she knew. She marched to the Kaaba with a heavy stone in her hand. Her gold bangles clinking with every step, her face dark with rage, she stormed into the gathering where the Prophet sat with Abu Bakr and other companions. She raised the stone and shouted loudly, "I heard your nephew has insulted me. Let me smash his mouth." But Muhammad was right there sitting in full view, yet Allah had veiled her sight. She saw Abu Bakr, but not the man she came to attack. She cursed and left in fury. Her power, her pride, her voice, all shook the Kaaba that day. But it was not her voice that Allah answered. It was her actions that earned her a place in Revelation. Few days later, a verse was revealed not only about her husband, but about her specifically. Surah Al-Masad, perish the hands of Abū Lahab, and perish he his wealth, and what he earned will not avail him. He will enter a fire of blazing flame, and his wife, the carrier of firewood around her neck as a rope of twisted fiber. It was the first and only time in the Qur'an that a woman was named in such symbolic destruction. Not by her name, but by her actions. She carried firewood, thorns, enmity, and the rope around her neck was not just of palm fiber, but of pride, ego, and hatred. When she heard the verse, her face turned pale. She realized the Prophet had not insulted her. He had revealed the truth from above, and that truth had burned through her veil of pride like sunlight through mist. But she did not stop. Instead, she doubled her efforts. She met with the Quraysh leaders at night in hidden rooms, calling for blood. She sent gold to mercenaries, asking them to frighten the new Muslims. She offered bribes to break the alliances of Muhammad with weaker tribes. Yet something was changing in Mecca. The slaves were rising. The weak were finding voice. And despite her plots, Islam was growing. And the more it grew, the more Jamil's fear turned to madness. She began to dream of burning trees and rope that pulled her neck in her sleep. Her maidservants whispered about her talking to shadows at night. Her husband grew distant as he too was humiliated again and again by the resilience of the Prophet. One night, as thunder cracked above Mecca, Jamil stood on the rooftop of her home, staring at the Kaaba lit only by the moonlight. She clenched her fists and whispered, "I am the daughter of war. I will never bow." But her voice trembled in that moment. She knew deep within her soul that something greater than her had entered the world, a light that even her thorns could not dim, flame of faith that burned brighter than her rage, and though she vowed to continue the fight, she could feel it slipping. The fear she had once inspired was now turning into something else. Pity. The woman who was once the most feared was becoming a symbol of everything the new believers had left behind. Hatred, arrogance, and resistance to truth. And this was only the beginning. The woman behind the curse. The days in Mecca grew heavier, not just with heat but with tension, as more hearts turned toward Islam. Jamil sat in her grand chamber, walls adorned with expensive fabric, servants moving silently around her, but her face was twisted not with age but with obsession. Every whisper of someone embracing the new faith felt like a knife to her chest. She could not understand how slaves like Bilal, once whipped into silence, now stood with heads high, proclaiming the name of Allah. She could not accept how women who once bowed before idols now found honor beside Muhammad, the man she despised the most. In public she still walked with pride, her gold anklets jingling like warnings, her eyes sharp enough to cut stone. But behind closed doors, her calm cracked. She began keeping scrolls of names. Those who followed him, those who supported him, those who dared defend him. She marked them like enemies on a battlefield. Her maid, named Safiya, once walked into her chamber late at night and found Jamil whispering over a bowl of ink, tracing names in circles and slashing them out with a red line. She looked up and said without blinking, "If they follow him, they fall with him, even if they are of my own blood." This obsession led her to spy on gatherings, listen behind curtains, and bribe travelers who had been near Medina. She wanted to know how many followed him, how many converted, what they spoke of at night around fire. She sent letters to tribes outside Mecca, offering silk and silver to those who could delay or damage Muhammad's message. No matter how many bribes, no matter how many threats, the faith kept spreading, and her own grip began to slip. She watched her husband Abū Lahab become more silent, more withdrawn. He'd once been respected among Quraysh, now even children mocked him for how he opposed the Prophet. Yet nothing worked. One evening, while attending a private gathering of Quraysh leaders, a man named Nadra ibn al-Harith whispered to her in frustration, "We have tried mocking him, threatening him, cursing him, but his people grow stronger. What more can we do?" She stared at the burning oil lamp beside her, leaned in and said with cold fury, "Then we must destroy what they love most, not just the man but his people, his message, his very soul." It was not an empty threat. She began spreading a dangerous rumor in the streets that the Muslims were plotting to poison the Kaaba, that they were enemies of the sacred city, that they sought to tear down the house of Allah and replace it with foreign beliefs. Her lies were crafted with skill enough to cause unrest and doubt among even the most neutral hearts, and yet the Prophet remained calm, always with a soft word, a kind glance, a wise reply. He never raised his voice against her, never cursed her name, even when she did everything to invite his wrath. And that quiet patience made her rage even more unbearable. But the breaking point came when her own cousin Lubaba, a noble woman of Mecca, embraced Islam openly. Jamil screamed when she heard the news, tore her scarf, and said, "She has brought shame to our name. Blood should mean loyalty. How could she betray us like this?" She stormed into Lubaba's home, demanding she repent. The two women, once close, stood face to face like fire and ice, but Lubaba only replied with tears in her eyes, "The truth has come, and I see what you refuse to see." Jamil raised her hand to strike, but stopped herself, trembling with rage. Instead she turned and left her cousin forever, her heart now fully consumed by hatred, no longer for a man or a message, but for the light that exposed the darkness inside her. She turned toward darker paths. One evening she met secretly with a man from a distant tribe known for sorcery. His hands were stained with powders and ash. His tent smelled of burnt herbs and oil. She asked him in a whisper, "Can you silence a man without touching him?" He gave her a bag of black seeds and strange stones, and said, "Bury this where he walks and recite what I give you, but beware, truth cannot be cursed. It only grows stronger in resistance." She returned to Makkah carrying that bag like it held her victory. Late that night, she went to the Prophet's usual path and buried the items, whispering strange phrases, trembling with a strange energy. She believed this was it. She believed she had finally found a way to win. But days passed and nothing changed. The Prophet walked as he always did, greeted people with warmth, helped the needy, smiled at children. There was not even a flicker of discomfort in him, and she began to unravel. She stopped attending social gatherings, spoke less even to her husband. Her once proud stride now carried heaviness. Her hair, once richly perfumed, now remained covered. Most days she would sit by her window, watching the city change, watching young men and women she once controlled now walk with heads high, free from her influence. And then the greatest insult arrived in the form of another revelation. More verses from the Qur'an continued to address her husband's legacy as one of the enemies of truth. But her shame was never removed. Her title remained in the divine verses, not with her name, but with her actions. Carrier of firewood, gatherer of harm, rope of twisted fiber around her neck. These were no longer rumors. They were now part of divine scripture recited by Muslims across lands and generations. Her name lived in infamy, while the man she tried to destroy was rising in glory. One night Safiya, her maid, found her crying, not loud, not wild, just silent tears falling down her wrinkled face. She was staring at the oil lamp in the corner, flickering. She whispered softly, "Why him? Why him of all people? Why not me? Why not my sons? Why was the light given to a man with nothing, and not to us who had everything?" Safiya had no answer. She left the room in silence. In her final days, Jamil became a ghost among her own people. She no longer controlled the gatherings, no longer spread rumors, No one feared her name. Now they pitied her story. Even Abū Lahab, who once followed her advice, began to doubt her, began to question whether their war was ever righteous. He fell ill, his wealth could not heal him, his power could not protect him, and when he died, it was not a noble death. He died alone in shame. People refused to approach his body for fear of disease. His own sons distanced themselves, and Jamil was left with only memories and the curse that history would not forget. She had tried to destroy a man chosen by the heavens, and in doing so she destroyed herself, her pride, her peace, and her name. But the strangest part remained. Though her deeds were cursed in the Qur'an, her name was not. Her punishment was left for hearts to understand and tongues to speak of in whispers. Even now, centuries later, when the verses of Surah Al-Masad are recited in prayer, her story continues. Her warning stands, for she was not just a woman of hatred. She was the living proof that pride without truth leads only to destruction. The fall of silence. The air in Makkah had changed, as if the winds themselves had chosen a side. More caravans arrived from Yathrib, now called Medina, speaking of peace, justice, and a man whose face was said to carry the light of prophethood. Every stone of the Kaaba, every alley of Quraysh, echoed with his name. Muhammad, his voice no longer a whisper in the desert, but a roar across Arabia. But in the high stone halls of a fading household, Jamil sat wrapped in a shawl, not from cold, but from the growing shadow within her. She had lost many things: her influence, her allies, even her husband who had died in disgrace, leaving behind no legacy, but a cursed name and divine verse. The servants who once obeyed her now murmured prayers. When they thought she could not hear, her sons had begun to speak with caution, fearful of her wrath, yet distant from her bitterness. One night her eldest son, Utbah, entered her chamber with a nervous look on his face. He held a letter in his hand from a cousin who had embraced Islam in Medina. He said, "The Prophet has found peace there. They say his followers grow daily. The tribes welcome him with love. Even former enemies now stand beside him." Jamil stared at the flickering candle, then looked up and said with a voice low and bitter, "Medina may embrace him, but it will never erase the shame he brought upon us." Utbah placed the letter down and left without another word. He knew better than to argue. Her hatred had not aged. It had fermented, turned darker with time and silence. But outside her walls the world kept changing. Islam was not just growing, it was thriving. Leaders of distant tribes came to Makkah, now not just for trade, but to understand this new message. Poor men had become respected elders. Women, once silenced, now taught the verses of the Qur'an. The structure of society had shifted, and it no longer bowed to the rules of the past. Jamil felt it like a slow erosion. Her name, once spoken with fear, was now mentioned only when reciting Surah Al-Masad, not as a warning of power, but as a caution of arrogance. Her own life had become a lesson. She began avoiding the streets altogether. She no longer visited the market, no longer hosted the women of Quraysh. She watched from her lattice windows as young children sang verses she had once tried to silence, watched as men who once served her now led prayer with calm conviction. One day, a girl no older than 10 stood outside her home reciting Surah Al-Ikhlas, her voice clear and sweet. Jamil pulled the curtain aside and shouted, "Be quiet. Do not disgrace the old with your chants." The girl looked up without fear and replied, "This is not disgrace. This is mercy," then walked away, leaving Jamil stunned by the calm in that child's words. That night Jamil did not sleep. She stared at the wall as the oil lamp burned low. The same surah echoed in her mind, not one of mockery but of purity, and she felt something crack inside, not pain, not regret, but something hollow. She began speaking to no one at first, then slowly to herself. Her maid Safia found her one morning mumbling lines from old poems, confusing them with Quranic verses, speaking of ropes and firewood and gold, all twisted into strange sentences. Safia told the family physician, who came quietly and checked her pulse, her eyes, her mind, and said, "She is not ill of the body, but her spirit is drowning. Still she refused rest, refused prayer, refused any word of repentance. Each time someone brought up the name of Muhammad, she would spit not from her mouth but from her soul. But the people no longer listened. They no longer feared, they no longer cared. She had become a shadow, a tale told to children as a warning. Do not be like her, do not carry hate as she did. Do not close your heart to truth, even when it knocks loudly. Then came the day that shook all of Quraysh, the day when the Muslims led by the Prophet entered Mecca, not with swords raised, but with heads bowed, not with revenge, but with forgiveness. Thousands of them marching into the city, with calm purpose, reciting the words of God and praising the one Lord. Jamil watched from behind her door curtains, trembling, her hands clutching the stone wall beside her. She had imagined this day so many times with fire and screams and banners of war, but this was nothing like what she feared. It was peace. The Prophet entered the Kaaba and removed the idols. One by one, declaring truth had come and falsehood had vanished. The same Kaaba she had sworn to defend now welcomed the very man she swore to destroy, and he never once asked about her. He never ordered her punished, never summoned her to account, never spoke her name in judgment, because her fate had already been sealed in verses, eternal words that reached beyond his lips into the hearts of those who listened. Later that evening, her own relatives embraced Islam. They came to her house filled with joy, asking her to join them, to leave behind the past and accept the mercy of God. But she refused. With eyes full of a strange fire, she said, I would rather walk into the flames than follow the man who ruined everything. Those were her last clear words. In the weeks that followed, she stopped speaking completely, sitting for hours, staring at the walls, murmuring sounds that made no sense. She refused food, refused water, refused any hand that reached to help her. And one quiet morning, she did not rise as Safiya found her seated in the same place, her eyes closed, her face still, her hands resting on her lap, like someone waiting for something that never came. The women of Makkah came to see her body. Some wept for what she once was, others remained silent, not out of respect, but uncertainty. They wrapped her in simple cloth, placed her in the earth without grand words, without ceremony. There was no poetry read, no praises sung, only the silence of those who had seen a legend fallen. As the sun set that day, casting long shadows across the desert, one man whispered under his breath, she carried firewood all her life, and in the end it consumed her. Her name was never forgotten, not because of greatness, not because of kindness, but because the Qur'an preserved her story as a warning to all who walk the path of arrogance and blind hatred. She had power, beauty, lineage, wealth, and fear, yet none of it saved her from the truth, because in the end, no matter how high a person stands, no matter how loud their voice, truth walks quietly behind them, and when it arrives, it does not knock, it enters. Warning that echoes forever. Long after Jamil's burial, the sands of Makkah continued to shift, not just beneath feet, but in hearts and in history. Her grave had no marker, no monument, no tribute, and yet her name lived in every child who memorized Surah Al-Masad, every prayer that warned against pride, every voice that rose against hatred. The city she once ruled with fear was now ruled by mercy. The very thing she had rejected was the thing her people embraced. Muhammad, the Prophet she swore to crush, had become the most beloved leader, not just in Mecca, but across Arabia. The poor she once ignored were now respected men. The slaves she mocked now led prayer. The women she silenced now taught others about justice and truth. Islam had done what her gold never could, had changed hearts. Jamil's own household had transformed. Her son Dora accepted Islam in secret. Then openly, her relatives, once ashamed of the Prophet, now traveled to Medina to sit in his gatherings and learn the same Qur'an that had exposed her deeds. They spoke of his forgiveness, his smile, his tears when he prayed, and his strength when tested. but none of them ever mentioned her name in his presence. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. They knew he would never curse the dead, never mock the lost, never take joy in someone's downfall. He had once said the dead have reached what they have earned, and that was enough. Qur'an had already given her the most lasting judgment, a role in divine scripture, not as a mother, not as a wife, not even by name, but by action. The woman who carried firewood, who harmed the path of truth, who bore a rope of pride around her neck. Her punishment was never a sword nor a prison. It was the preservation of her misdeeds for all of time. The years that followed, Islam grew beyond Mecca, beyond Medina. It crossed deserts, climbed mountains, sailed across seas, and with it came the verses that held her legacy. Children in lands she had never heard of recited her story in evening prayer. Elders warned the youth, do not carry firewood like she did. Poets crafted words comparing her to the darkness that could not hide from the light, and scholars debated what her story meant in deeper meanings of faith and ego. She became a symbol of what happens when truth is resisted, not because it is false, but because it threatens pride. Her life was the reflection of many who walk in arrogance, thinking their power protects them from justice. Her silence and death louder than her voice in life. But what makes her story truly terrifying is that it did not end with her. Throughout history, in every corner of the world, there have been people who followed her path, not in name, but in nature. People who mock truth, insult those who rise for justice, spread lies to protect their own image, who believe position is higher than principle, and fear losing power more than losing peace. And so the verses that captured her spirit were never just about her. They were about everyone who chooses ego over guidance, everyone who blocks the path of light because they are too proud to accept its shine. A scholar from Andalusia once said, if you want to know how Allah warns a soul, look at the verse of the firewood. It does not call her by name, for her actions were louder than her identity. It was never about her being a woman. It was about her being unjust. It was not about her wealth. It was about how she used it. It was not about her voice. It was about what she said with it. The prophet never called her evil by name, never cursed her, never returned the pain she caused. But the Qur'an recorded what was necessary, a warning clothed in wisdom, a lesson buried in the rhythm of divine words. Jamil became the reflection of human weakness when blinded by hate. She had everything the world respects: beauty, lineage, status, wealth, influence, but none of it could compete with the light of one man standing on truth. None of it could erase the power of sincerity, mercy, and trust in Allah. The women of Makkah used to tell stories at night, and some would whisper the tale of a woman whose hands bled from planting thorns, whose tongue grew dry from speaking poison, who sat in her palace while her soul starved. And then they would say, may we never be like her, may we never burn in this life before the next. Her story lived on, not to shame her, but to awaken others. In the Mosque of the Prophet, a group of young girls once asked Isha, the wife of the Prophet, about the woman mentioned in the cursed verse. They said, why did Allah reveal such words about her? And Asisha replied, she was not cursed by the Prophet. She was cursed by her own deeds. Allah only exposed what she had already chosen. That was the truth. She chose her path, and she walked it with pride. But the truth does not bend for pride. It does not bow before gold or bloodline. It flows like a river around every stone, and those who try to stop it only drown. And so she remained a story, whispered a verse, recited a lesson, repeated in every generation. Rope around the neck of arrogance, a firewood bearer in the path of mercy. A woman who feared being forgotten, and yet remembered in the very way she hoped to avoid. Not in honor but in warning, not in praise but in parable, not for what she was born with but for what she chose to become. And perhaps that is the final lesson her story teaches, not just to those of her time, but to all who read about her now. In the end, the only thing that matters is what we build with our hands, what we carry in our hearts and what we leave behind in our deeds. Because wealth fades and status breaks, but what we do for or against the truth becomes our echo long after we are gone. Jamil did not fall because she was born flawed. She fell because she refused to rise when the truth came near, and that refusal became her legacy. May we choose better. The end.